Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the AI Cup, which is part of the Chess Champions Tour being held on chess.com. Now, as you guys know, I lost to Magnus Carlsen yesterday in the quarterfinals, and today Magnus was playing as the runner-up in the World Championship match from 2 years ago, Ian Nepomniachtchi. So let's jump right into the action. Now, format the same as always in the winners bracket with a 4-game match, 15 minutes plus 3-second increment for each game. And if the match is tied at 2, they go to Armageddon. So we're not going to take a look at every single game in depth, but we will be peeking in. So in game 1, the game starts with e4, Magnus with the white pieces, Ian responds with e5. We get knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5 and d6. And this, of course, is the classic Petrov's defense, which Magnus has faced many times in multiple world championship matches against Fabiano, as well as Ian Nepomniachtchi. So we get knight f3, knight e4, Magnus plays this queen e2 variation with queen e7, d3, knight f6, and knight c3. Now, for many years, this line has been known as the line that you play to draw the game if you're playing with the white pieces, because queens come off the board immediately, and there really is no imbalance here because we have the exact same pawn structure with a perfect mirror for both sides. So due to the mirror, people generally assume that these lines lead to forced draws, but Magnus has other ideas in mind, and we get bishop e7, bishop d2, castles. Magnus decides to castle to the queen side. We get a6 here from Ian, rook h e1, and now we have rook e8, d4, h6, all pretty normal so far. Magnus plays bishop d3, and here Ian plays this interesting move, bishop g4. Now the reason behind bishop g4 is to pin the knight on f3, and maybe down the road you can trade the bishop for the knight and weaken white's pawn structure. So Magnus plays h3. We get the swap here. Now this is actually a slight mistake from Ian. Mind you, computer says after d5 and c6 black is still okay, but Ian plays the move knight c6. Magnus goes knight to e2. We get the move knight to h7, and now after rook g1, bishop g5, f4, bishop h4, rook g2, knight f8, and c3. White has a very clean advantage here. White has a nice pawn structure with the pawns from b2 to d4, and even though you have these double pawns, White can go for the double stack on the g file. The bishops on d2 and d3 are perfectly placed as well, and White has a significant advantage. Now Magnus would continue to build on his advantage. The game continues with bishop f6, knight to g3, with this nasty idea of knight to h5, putting maximum pressure on the g file. Game continues with g6. We get the move knight to h5, bishop g7, and now Magnus plays another brilliancy with f5. Now the reason this is such a brilliancy is that black is really struggling to keep the g file closed here. If you take the knight, which looks free on first glance, after rook d to g1, you have the double stack. White's crashing through on the g file. There's no blockade really with knight g6, and you're just in a lot of trouble. Additionally, if you play a move like bishop h8, White can simply take on h6, and now you're down a pawn. You're probably going to lose the second pawn on g6, and it's all totally hopeless. And most importantly, White just has a very nice center with this chain, and black has no targets whatsoever. So Ian does actually take the knight on h5. We get rook d g1, knight to g6 is played here, and now Magnus takes the knight on g6, and Ian plays f6 here, trying desperately to keep this g file closed. Now on first glance, it looks like maybe black is okay because the material is still the same, but White is just completely winning here due to these weak pawns, the bad bishop on g7, and some other ideas as well. So we get bishop c4, king h8. Magnus plays rook g3 here, a nice move to activate the rook to the f file and go after both the pawn on h5 as well as the pawn on f6. We get f5 here from Nepo. Magnus plays rook f3. We get rook to f8, and now another nasty move, bishop to f7. Pawn guards the bishop from g6 to f7. Pawn on f5 now cannot really be defended easily, and the position is simply crumbling. So Ian plays knight d8 here, trying to trade the knight for the bishop. If he were to go knight to e7, there's rook to e1, attacking the knight on e7, and after a move like bishop to f6, there's simply bishop takes h6, and these bishops are winning the game for White. So we get knight d8. We have rook takes f5, knight takes f7, gf7, king to h7 here, rook to e1, trying to create the kebab on the 7th rank. We have king g6, rook to f3, and now Ian finds a very critical move, bishop to f6 here, with the idea of taking the pawn on f7. Now up to this point, Magnus is playing a masterful game. He's just dominating the board, but here he starts to go a little bit astray. First he plays bishop takes h6, we get rook takes f7, and now he plays bishop d2. Now position is still very good, but it actually becomes a little bit easier for Nepo to play here after rook g8 because he wants to put the king on h7, maybe stack the rooks on the f file, and White doesn't have an easy way to attack the queenside pawns here with bathtub formation or the pawn on h5. Nonetheless, it still should be winning for a player of Magnus Carlsen's caliber. So we get king c2, king h7 is played, Magnus goes rook f5, king to g6 back, guarding the pawn and attacking the rook at the same time. We have the move rook to d5 here. Magnus's idea, very simple, to play rook g1 and then win the pawn on h5. So Jan plays rook h7, we get king to d3, king to f7 played, rook back to f5, rook to g2 played here, and now Magnus finds a very creative move, rook to e3, intending to double stack on this open f-file. Game continues with king g6, Magnus plays rook e f3, and now we get the move bishop to e7, and here bishop e3 is played, another nice move guarding the pawn on f2. Nepo plays rook g1, Magnus plays a4 here, a move that isn't necessary, but it still is good to start pushing p on the queen side. We get rook to h1 here, and now king e4 is played. Now if Magnus were to play say a move like b4, this would be a huge blunder, because after rook takes h3, suddenly if you take the rook, your rook on f5 hangs, and black actually is close to winning due to this past h1. Maybe close to winning is a little bit too much, but black is better. So Magnus goes king to e4. Now the king will guard the rook if you take the pawn on h3. Nepo plays rook to g1 back to stop the rook g3 check, and here Magnus inexplicably plays this move rook g3. Now this is a horrible move from Magnus, and I suspect that Magnus simply did not see the right way to continue. Now the easiest way to win the game is to use this active king here and march forward with king to d5, because now the idea is simply that you want to go king to e6 and put pressure on the bishop on e7, and because black has no pawns around the king, no knights or any light square bishops, the king is very safe on the e6 square. So if Magnus would play king to d5, the game is effectively over. Let's just say black were to play bishop h4, for example. You do not go king e6 because then there is rook to e7 check, but instead you play rook to f8. Now you have ideas like rook c8 or rook b8, and suddenly all of these pawns become very weak here for black, and white also has ideas like rook g8 as well, and it's just totally hopeless. But instead Magnus plays this move rook g3, and after the rook swap and bishop f6, now black's idea is to play rook e7, checking the king. Magnus retreats with rook f3. We get this move c6, king to d3, and now after d5 the position is very difficult to win, because when we look forward to an endgame, all of Jan's pawns here are on the light squares, which are the opposite color of this dark square bishop that white has. Additionally, the pawn structure is very symmetrical here, and so at this point it's very difficult to win. Magnus would not actually go on to win this game. In fact, we reach this endgame here where Magnus ends up putting his pawns on the same color as Nepo's bishop. Meanwhile, these pawns for Nepo are all in the light squares and can't be attacked, and the game would eventually be drawn after many more moves. I don't really need to go super in depth, but Magnus was unable to make any progress. Eventually he tries to push the pawns on the queen side, but it's to no avail, because essentially what happens here is the king has no entries. You can't get either to c5 or e5 because the bishop will always prevent it. Additionally, you can never attack these light square pawns because they're on the opposite color of the bishop, and the game will eventually end in a draw. We see a bunch of moves being played, and eventually when the king gets to f4, there's bishop d6 to stop the king from entering, and the game ends peacefully very soon after a few more moves, simply due to the fact that there's no entry for Magnus's king. So this is game number one, and this is a huge miss for Magnus to not win this game. He was completely winning in an endgame, his forte. As I've said before, I do consider Magnus to be the greatest endgame player of all time, without a doubt. Now, whether he's the greatest ever overall is a question for debate between himself and Garry Kasparov, but in terms of endgames, he is second to nobody, or second to none, and it's not even remotely close. So for Magnus to mess up this first game is definitely a big surprise, but alas, it is what it is. So let's move on to the second game. So now in the second game, we have Nepo playing with the white pieces, and the match tied at 50-50. So the game starts with e4. Magnus plays as a Sicilian. We get knight f3, d6, and now this move bishop b5 from Nepo. A decision to avoid the open Sicilian with d4. So we get knight d7. Magnus castles, or knight d7, Jan castles. We get a6, we get bishop e2. Now this move already is a little bit unusual from Nepo, but apparently it's an idea that computers show to be quite strong. So we get knight f6, d3, and this looks really ridiculous because normally in a lot of these Sicilians you take on d7, or if black plays knight f6, rook e1, and a6, you go to f1, or even something like c3 and bishop a4. So the key squares are f1 or a4, or bishop takes d7, but this idea with bishop e2 is not common. Nonetheless, as I said, computers have shown it to be an interesting idea. So we get e6, a4, b6, knight f d2, bishop e7, and now Nepo plays f4, trying to expand on the king side. We get castles, bishop to f3, threatening to go e5, winning the knight or the rook. Magnus plays bishop b7, and now we get this move, knight to c3. Magnus plays d5, and here Nepo plays the extremely strong move g4. Now g4 is the top computer move. I don't know whether Nepo has looked at this for the Canvas or the World Championship, but the fact that he played g4 shows that he is familiar with this pawn structure and or this exact line. So we get knight to b8 from Magnus. Now g5 is played, knight to e8 here, intending to reroute the knight to c7 and guarding the pawn on d5. And then after you guard the pawn, you have knight c6 and knight d4. Nepo trades on d5, plays bishop g2. Magnus goes knight c7. He cannot play knight c6 right away because then you simply hang the pawn on d5. So we get knight c7. Nepo plays knight c4, an excellent move here, trying to take advantage of the fact that if you take the knight, you lose your bishop on b7. We get knight to c6 being played, and this was a clean blunder from Magnus Carlsen. The reason we know this was a blunder is when I was doing my live coverage of this game and the event on my Kick channel, Magnus started shaking his head as soon as knight takes b6 was played. Now, the reason that we know this is a blunder, at least my speculation, I haven't watched the interview, is that after Magnus plays rook b8, he simply hung a second pawn on d5. I strongly suspect that Magnus saw the pawn was hanging on b6, but after rook b8, he didn't realize that this pawn on d5 was only guarded by the knight and the queen. Now, any beginner would do the math and see 1, 2 guarding the pawn, whereas white has 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking. 3 pieces attacking, 2 guarding, 3 is greater than 2. So maybe Magnus needs to take some more math classes. So after rook b8, we get knight takes pawn, knight takes, and knight d4. Now, one thing that's very frustrating about playing against Magnus Carlsen is somehow, even when he makes blunders, now this doesn't apply to every situation, but in a lot of cases, even when he makes clean blunders, somehow there's still some counterplay or some chances for him to survive. And this game is no exception, because even though he's down 2 pawns here, he has a great bastion with the knight on d4. The rook on b8 puts pressure on the pawn on b2, and white has already overextended some of the kingside pawns. So the game continues with bishop d6. We get bishop to e3. Magnus plays knight f5 here, threatening to take the knight on d5 and then win the bishop on e3. Game continues with bishop d2. Magnus takes on d5. Nepo recaptures. Magnus recaptures. And here Nepo plays this horrible move, bishop to c3. Now, at first glance, the move that's screaming to be played is this move knight to e3, which forks the queen, the rook, the pawn, and the bishop. Now, after Nepo played this move, Magnus started to think for a little bit, and Jan, I want to say after about 30 seconds, we could see on his cam, his eyes started getting really big. It was like this. Fortunately for Jan, he was able to recover and bring it back and look nonchalant very quickly, even though he realized it was a blunder and Magnus was not able to spot it. Now, the reason this is such a big blunder is here there's a move queen takes g5, sacking the queen, and it leads to a forced checkmate. If white captures the queen, you have bishop takes h2. The rook guards the bishop and covers the squares on the second rank. And after king to h1, knight g3 is gg. Checkmate, good game. You resign, you lose, it's all over. You don't actually resign, you just lose. So after queen takes g5, if white were to block with a bishop, queen takes bishop is checkmate. And after king to h1, you have knight to g3, checking the king. If pawn takes knight is played, you have queen h6 check, king g1, and queen h2, which would be game over. And if you play king to g1, now black can play this move knight to e4, cutting off the bishop from g2. If you go king h1, it's queen g2 checkmate, and if you take the queen, it's the same mate as before with bishop takes h2, king h1, and knight to g3. So Magnus plays knight e3, and somewhere during this time, I think after Nepo played queen e1 or right before he played it, Magnus actually realized that he had made a blunder. He leaned way back in his chair, started swiveling all over the place, and he simply could not contain himself. But Magnus played knight e3. Now here Nepo played queen to e1. Magnus plays knight takes bishop. We get bishop takes rook and knight takes f4. And now after queen to h4, the dust is somewhat settled. But even though Magnus has missed a checkmate and a forced win, he still has a lot of counterplay, even though he's down a rook for a knight, because white's king is open with these pawns that have been pushed on the king side. d3 is weak, and there still are some good practical chances. But Magnus was sort of unable to contain himself, and he plays the move knight takes d3. And what I mean by contain himself is that he simply was very, very upset and was struggling to find any interest in the game. So after knight d3, we get bishop c3, bishop e5 is played, Nepo trades and goes rook to e1 here, and Magnus is a passive rook. White's rook is on the open file. f7 is a little bit weak, and technically speaking, this should be close to a winning endgame. So we get knight g6, queen g4 is played, rook e8 here, and now Nepo plays h4. Not the best move. Queen to f5 would have been winning here to force the rook back to f8 to guard the pawn, and now after queen takes c5, white has simply a rook for a knight because the pawns are now even at 4 apiece. Instead, we get h4. Magnus trades the rooks and goes knight to f8. Nepo plays rook f1. We get g6 here. And now we have the inexplicable move queen to f3 being played by Nepo after 8 seconds. Now, in this position, white is still better, but it is a little bit tricky to win because black's king is very safe on g8. The pawns guard the king. Your king is a little bit open. Their ideas like queen d4 and or knight e6 and knight d4. So it's not easy to win. Nonetheless, after queen to f3, there's queen d4, checking the king. You move the king, and now you lose the pawn on c4, and the queen guards the pawn on f7, and all hopes for Nepo to win this game are gone just like that. Now, the game would end peacefully after a few more moves. We get a5, queen e6, rook f2, c4, we get rook e2, queen d7, and here we get a repetition. The players repeat the moves with the queens, and the second game ends in a draw. Now, another game that's really back and forth. Nepo could have won. Magnus missed a forced checkmate, but the game ends in a draw. So the match is tied 1-1 as we move into the third game. So in the third game, Magnus with the white pieces starts with e4. Again, we get a Petrov here with knight takes e5, d6, knight f3 takes, and d4. This game follows a very traditional path here. We have one of the standard variations. I won't go into the moves here. We get knight to c3, which is played. Queen b3 is another move that's been played before. So it's a very topical line in the Petrov. So we get knight c3. We get a bunch of trades here. Knight d7. Magnus plays queen b3. Nepo goes queen c7, activating the queen, threatening the pawn on h2 potentially, and guarding the pawn on b7. Magnus goes c4. We get rook to f to e8. g3 is played. b6 is played here. Bishop b2. And now Nepo plays bishop f8. Now again, very, very stable position. Not a whole lot of play for either side. We get a4 from Magnus. a6 is played. And now we have king to g2. h6 played. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. And now Magnus finds this move bishop c1. Now here the position is still relatively balanced, but it's starting to lean in Magnus's direction for a couple of reasons. If black ever goes c5 and we get d5 being played, we have a classic structure where white has a protected passed pawn, and this b6 pawn is always going to be a weakness. So if you can't push c5, you want to push b5, but right now white is controlling the b5 square with a queen and 2 pawns, and so the pawn on b6 is effectively a weakness. So we get rook to b8. Magnus plays queen c2, preventing b5. Actually, it doesn't prevent b5, I should say. But after b5, I think white can trade and maybe play something like a5, maybe bishop f4 as well. So Nepo plays rook e8, a move that I don't really like. b5 is one option. c5 is another option where after d5, b5, computer thinks it's very close to equal. So instead we get rook to e8. Magnus plays a5 here. b5, we get the swap of the pawns, and now bishop f4, bishop d6, the trade, and a6. Now, position is very, very drawish according to computer, but there are some issues in human play. The big issue for black is that white has a passed a pawn with the rook behind it. Additionally, the pawn on c6 is a little bit weak, and both these pawns are weak on c6 and b5 relative to this current strength with the pawn on a6. So we have rook to a8. Magnus plays a7. We get queen to c7, and now rook a6 is played, and here Nepo blunders with the move knight to f8. Here Nepo needed to play this move c5. Now I don't know exactly why he chose not to play it. He probably saw the boogeyman here, not to be confused with John Wick of course, but he probably saw the boogeyman and thought that after queen to e4, rook takes a7, there's probably some line like queen e8, knight f8, and rook c6 where he thought if he goes queen a5, rook c8 wins the game on the spot. And if he plays something like queen e7 after the trade and d takes c5, he probably thought this was scary with the passed pawn, or maybe even rook c5 and he missed the pawn hanging on b5. Nonetheless, Nepo goes knight f8 instead, which is a very passive move and a bad move. And the reason it's so bad is now also white's knight on f3 can start jumping into the action. And so intuitively, you should sense it's not right. But Nepo plays it instead of going for c5. And now Magnus Carlsen is absolutely ruthless. First of all, he plays queen c5, guarding the pawn on a7. Nepo plays knight e6, the only move here. Magnus takes with the rook. The best move, if black captures a queen, you capture this queen, and after knight e6, rook b7, white is simply winning the game here with threats like rook to b8 on the next turn. So Nepo goes queen b7, not queen takes a7, by the way, because now after rook to c8 check, you cannot capture the rook because then you lose the queen. And after king to h7, there's queen f5 check, g6. Now you swap the rooks on a8, and after queen takes rook, queen f7, knight g7, and d5. White is simply winning. You're pushing p up the board with d6, d7, d8. There's also knight to e5, pressuring the pawn on g6, and it's totally hopeless. So Nepo goes queen b7. Magnus plays queen b6, again the best move. And here Nepo plays the move rook takes a7, hoping for a queen trade on b7, after which black be relatively fine. Instead, we get d5 from Magnus, and now Nepo plays this move knight to f8, which is a big mistake. What Nepo needed to do here was trade the queens and play knight to c5, and after rook b5, knight d7, white has an extra pawn in the center of the board, but there should be some pretty decent practical drawing chances. Now again, against a player like Magnus Carlsen, would Nepo draw this? I don't really know. I think it's unlikely, but this is the best chance. Instead, Nepo plays knight f8, Magnus plays queen c5 here. Again, the best move with the idea of rook to c8, creating the classic right triangle, as well as winning the knight on f8. We get knight to d7 being played here by Nepo. Magnus plays rook to c8 check. We get king h7, and now after queen c2, Magnus just rattles off all these moves and wins this game in short order. We get g6, queen to c3, threatening the classic checkmate in the corner with the right triangle, of course, 90 degrees. We get knight to f6 here, stopping the mate, and a tricky move because if white takes the knight, you lose the rook on c8. Additionally, it feels like maybe you're hitting the pawn on d5. It shouldn't be that bad, but Magnus just blows Nepo away here. He plays d6, which is the best move here. We get the move b4 here, trying to deflect the queen from this diagonal. If white ever moves the queen off, then you lose the rook. So the queen has to go off of the diagonal towards h8. But after queen to c7, this is just hopeless, because now if Nepo tries to trade the queens after pawn takes a knight d5, you do not win the pawn because I sack the rook with rook to h8, and after king takes rook, white gets a queen and wins the game. Additionally, white is threatening to play queen d8 and checkmate you on the back rank as well, and so it's just GG on the spot. Nepo plays g5, Magnus trades the queens, plays rook c7. The best move, you cannot trade the queens because then I get a new queen. Or trade the rooks because I get a new queen. And after rook to b5, Magnus takes the pawn. We get king g6, d7, threatening to queen the pawn here. Rook to d5. Now Magnus plays knight to e5, the best move in the position. All these moves being played very fast by Magnus, and this leads to a forced win after king f5 and knight to g4. And the reason this is just GG on the spot is now the knight is pinned here, and when you take the knight, white takes this knight, and your king is actually stuck in what we call a checkmate net, or a mating net to be more precise. And what I mean by that is your king cannot escape checkmate very easily. If you take the pawn on d7, I go h3 or f3, both work. King h5, g4 checking the king, king h4, and rook takes h6 is checkmate. So Nepo plays king h5, Magnus plays h3, and here Nepo resigns because again, g4 with the checkmate idea is only stoppable if you play g4 yourself. But after g4, I sack the rook with rook to f5 here, and after rook takes rook, I get a queen and win the game. So a masterful game from Magnus after the first two games have been a really wild roller coaster adventure. He finds basically 5 or 6 great moves in the endgame to win after missing a forced checkmate in game 2. So Magnus takes a 2-1 lead as we go into the fourth and final game, where Nepo has the white pieces and he must win. So the game starts with e4, and this time around Nepo decides to play the open Sicilian. He plays d4 because he needs to win the game. So Magnus trades on d4. We get knight f6, knight c3, and Magnus decides to play the Najdorf with a6. Here Nepo plays bishop g5. We get e6, queen to f3. Already a little bit unusual. Normally white will play moves like f4 here, but we get queen f3 instead. We get h6, and now another strange move, bishop d2. Now bishop to e3 looks a little bit normal for me because now when you castle, the rook is on an open d file, but when you go back to d2 here, after we get a couple more moves, the rook is blocked by this bishop, so you don't have any threats. That being said, I suspect this was still probably some sort of unusual preparation that Nepo has done for the candidates or the world championship matches of the past. So we get knight bd7. Nepo plays queen to e2 here, knight to e5, and now we have this move f3 being played. And Nepo's idea is very simple. He wants to play something like bishop e7, h4. Let's say black just plays rook g8, go rook g1, rook h8, and g5, knight d7, and g6, undermining these pawns on f7 and e6, or even f4 and something like f4, f5. And it's very, very hard to deal with this massive pawns that are rushing on the king side. So Magnus plays g5 here, trying to stop f4 and trying to create a nice bastion for the knight on e5. We get h4, rook g8 to swap of pawns. King b1 is played. Now Magnus goes bishop to e7. We get rook to h6, knight f d7, and the move queen to h2 here. Nepo trying to exert some pressure here in the center of the board as well as the king side. Magnus has a tough choice here because on the one hand, he has to decide, does he castle the king out of the center, or what does he do with this king? Obviously, you can never move the king towards the king side with this open h file, and so already it's a very precarious situation. Now here Magnus plays the move bishop to f6, which to me is a very strange move. Now I don't know what Magnus said in the post-game interviews in terms of why he went for this, but it's a crazy move to play in a situation where you only need a draw, because if you were to castle the king here, white is still better after a move like bishop e3, king b8, and something like queen to f2, or even bishop g1 with queen f2 threatening the diagonal, or bishop h2 as well. But again, you're still very much in the game. But when Magnus plays f6, he's basically baiting or disrespecting Nepo and forcing Nepo to sacrifice some material. So Nepo is up for the challenge in a situation where he must win to force an Armageddon game. He obviously is happy to sack the knight on b5. We get knight takes, pawn takes, knight takes. Magnus goes queen b6, and now we get bishop b4, and it's very clear that Magnus has a lot of issues here. This knight is jumping towards the center of the board. There are all kinds of forks in play. Additionally, your pieces are very, very weak here, even on f6 and e5, because there are a lot of sacks as well. So at this point, it looks like Magnus is in real danger and might lose the match, or lose the game, I should say. So we get bishop e7, Nepo plays knight takes pawn, we get bishop takes, rook takes, and now Magnus plays this move queen c7. Now the computer says after bishop c6, white is still better after bishop e2, but here you can castle the king out of the center on move number 24, and maybe you're still in the game. Instead, we get queen c7, and now Nepo sacks the rook with rook takes e6. Magnus takes the rook, we get rook takes pawn, king to d8, and here it's looking very much like Nepo is in some trouble. He's down a rook and a piece here for, I believe, 1 2 3 4 5 pawns. So he's down a rook and a bishop for 5 pawns. It's a very serious material imbalance here, but it is good for Nepo. So we get queen h7, which is a mistake. Bishop to d6 would have been the best move, because after a move like queen to a5, you have queen h7 attacking the rook, and the rook simply has no good squares in this position. And you also have queen e7 threats as well. Let's say black has queen e1, king a2, and rook f8 as one example. You have queen e7, king c8, and now you sack the queen with queen to e8. And after rook takes queen, rook takes rook, it's just checkmate. King simply has no squares to move to. So instead, we get queen h7, knight to f6, queen f5, and now Magnus goes back with knight fd7 again, simply overlooking this idea with bishop d6 for a second time. Now, if Magnus had played knight ed7, it would have been very interesting to see how the game would have continued, because after rook takes knight and queen to e5, we get a very, very unusual imbalance after rook e6, queen takes f5, g takes f5, where white essentially has 5 pawns here for a rook as well as the bishop pair, and computer thinks that white should be winning. Nonetheless, we get knight fd7, bishop d6, queen takes bishop is played here, because Magnus does realize after queen f5, queen a5, queen h7, we're back in the same line as before, where white is completely winning. So Magnus sacks the queen and goes king c7 here. Nepo plays rook f6, rook f8, trade, queen takes pawn, rook takes pawn, bishop b5, bishop b4. We get the trade here, and now the dust is settled where white has a queen and 4 pawns versus a rook, a bishop, and a knight. Now, with so many pawns and the fact that the pawns are split wide, or we have the wide peepos, it should be a pretty easy win. Nonetheless, Nepo starts to get sloppy pretty much from the get-go. So we get this position, queen b4, rook f4, check, king d8, g5, rook f2, and now Nepo plays this hilariously bad move, queen to e3. Now, in this position, if white were to play queen to e1, after say a move like bishop c2 and king c1, white probably is winning here after rook g2, because you can check. If black goes king c8, there's queen a8 winning the rook. But even besides that, I think queen c3, king b7, and queen takes c2 is also probably winning, because once again you have the wide peepos, and black cannot stop all the pawns here. If you play knight e5, something like a4, king b6, b4, king a6, let's say you go a5, king b5. Actually, this is maybe a draw here, I have to be careful, but let's say you get this position, king b6 here, king e3, king b6, a5 here, and after king e4, white is winning, because if you try to stop this one, I bring the king up, and now the pawns guard each other, and I push p. Additionally, if you try to go this way, now suddenly I go g6, takes, g7, knight e7, a6, king b5, a7, and again, you can't stop the wide peepos. So instead we get queen e3, which is a big mistake, because now after rook f1 check, king a2, you've now lost one of your 4 pawns. So you've lost one of the pawns already, and now it's going to be a little bit of a task to win the game. So the game continues. There are many more moves played. I don't want to go super into the weeds of the intricacies of this end game, but we get rook e4, check, rook e3, here check, king comes back. And now after b6, it looks like white is winning. Now b6 is not a move that I necessarily like. g6 was also playable here as well. So we get b6, bishop d5, G6 played here, rook to E6, queen C7, king to E7, and now Nepo plays B7, which is another big mistake here. What Nepo needed to play was this move A5 here, supporting the pawn, because after rook takes G6 and B7, if black goes rook G8, there's A6, A7, and white is winning this endgame. And if black sacks after takes, you're just going to push A6, A7, A8 and win as well. But when Nepo plays B7, now black can take the pawn on B7, and if you take the bishop, there's rook B6 check, and after the trade, G7, king F7, it's simply a draw, because after king B3, I sack the knight for the pawn. If you go A5, I have knight C4 winning the pawn as well. So suddenly the advantage is completely gone. So Nepo plays G7, and here Magnus, with limited time on the clock, plays a move rook G6. Now this position is actually a draw, because you can play rook to E2 check, king to C3, and now you have bishop D5, preventing white from queening the pawn. And now white has lost 2 of the 4 pawns, and will probably lose the 3rd pawn. Let's just say A5 rook G2, A6 rook takes G7. You've lost 3, and even if you get an endgame like this, for example, with A8, this is also a theoretical draw with a rook and a knight versus the queen. So instead, Magnus plays rook G6. We get queen takes bishop, rook takes pawn, A5 is played, and now rook G6. Very tricky move here, because if you play A6, there is rook B6 check once again, which would draw the game. So we get king C2, king to D8, king C3, rook to G3, king B2, rook G6, king C2, rook G5, and now we have A6. And at this point, we're like, Magnus is going to lose the game. We're headed to Armageddon, because it feels like you can't stop the A pawn. So we get rook C5 check, king D2, rook C7, we get queen to A8, king rook C8, and now we have queen to H1, rook to C7, and here Nepo plays queen H4, we get king to E8, and now this move queen to H5 check is played. Now again, Nepo has nearly 40 seconds on the clock here, and in this position, queen to F4, I believe queen to G3 as well. There are many different moves that are winning here, because if you go queen F4 hitting the rook, if black plays rook A7, you have queen E3 check, winning the rook on A7 here. If black plays king to D8 in this position, now you can go queen G5, king to E8, and now you have A7 here, because after rook takes pawn, you have queen to E3 check once again, winning the rook on A7. Instead, Nepo checks, we get king to E7, queen G5, and suddenly after king D6, it gets very tricky again, because Nepo has helped Magnus march his king towards his pawn on A6. So we get queen B5, rook to A7 played, king C3, king C7, now king B4 is played here. A big mistake, by the way, because after knight to B8, the game would effectively be a draw, because after queen C5 check, there's king to D8 here, and you cannot take the rook due to the fork of the king and the queen. And after, say, queen to D4, king C8, black is simply going to win this pawn, or you're going to basically have to keep checking him all over the board. And again, white can never win material, and if you lose the pawn on A6, it's a draw. Instead, Magnus plays king D6, and now we get king A5, king C7, queen B4, knight to B8, and here Magnus is able to play queen B6, king C8, and this very nice move, queen to E6 check. Again, you cannot capture the rooks. After knight C6, king B6 takes king C7, this would be a draw. So here we get the move queen E6, king C7, check, king D8. Nepo finds king B6, rook takes pawn, king B7, and now we end up in an endgame with a queen versus rook. Now, normally this should be a forced win. According to table base, it is a forced win. With limited time on the clock, it seems pretty straightforward as well, but Nepo actually is unable to win this. Now, I'm not going to get super deep into the weeds of this, but there comes a critical moment somewhere around right around here, where the players have made about 12 to 13 moves, and this is where Nepo has to use some of his time with 37 seconds to come up with the right technique. Now, the correct way to try and win this game is to play king to D5 here, bringing the king back towards the center. We get rook to F7, and now king E5, we get king to F8, and here Nepo plays this move queen to H6, king to E8, and now queen G5, king to D7, and here he plays this move queen G6. Now, this is winning. The correct way to win this, by the way, or the right technique in general, is essentially what you want to do is you need to try and force the black king over towards the edge of the board. And there's one very basic position that I'll show you guys that is a forced win, just to set it up, which is this is the classic position that is well known to be winning, where you get the king on A5 and the queen on D8, or additionally you get this position with the king on B5 and queen E8. Both of these diagonals with the king on, say, A7, or even just to illustrate the point, even no matter where it is on the board, for example, just to show you guys how this goes, just to set it up, even this one is also winning, but generally you need the diagonals. You need these diagonals to be winning in these end games, in order for it to be an easy win. But Nepo plays queen g6, we get king e7, check, queen a3, king d7, and now he wastes some moves with queen b6, and after rook e7, king f6, rook f7, king g6, rook to d7. Nepo is unable to find the winning plan, and the game eventually ends with a 50 move repetition. Even here, after king to e8, you need to play a move like queen c5 here, because now if king d8, again you have king to e6 here with all these tricks, and the rook will have to move away from the king. Nepo continues to play moves way too quickly in this endgame. The times aren't completely accurate because Nepo's still at 30 seconds, but eventually the game does end in a draw after 50 moves. Rook f7, by the way, nice touch, because if you take the rook, this would simply be stalemate. The king has no squares. King g6, rook c7, queen a4, king e7, king f5, and Nepo actually doesn't even come remotely close to winning this endgame. Magnus defends it very easily, and we eventually end with a draw of 50 moves here in this position. Now, the irony, of course, is that by the end of this game at this position, after king a8, queen d8, king a7, king c6, we've reached this endgame that is winning, but because it's been more than 50 moves without a capture, the game automatically ends in a draw. So very, very disappointing for Nepo to not win this endgame. He had plenty of time, 40 seconds plus, unable to win. I think this sort of speaks volumes about Nepo's play, how sometimes he's a little bit too hasty, a little bit too quick. He doesn't slow down at certain moments that he needs to, and he pays a very heavy price because this match should have gone to Armageddon. Who knows what would have happened there, but Nepo should have won this fourth game and tied the match at 2. At any rate, he does not win this game, and the match ends up in favor 2.5, 1.5 for Magnus, who moves on to the finals of the winners bracket. I believe he will be playing as Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in a repeat of the semifinals, or the actually I played Maxime, so I guess not a repeat of semifinals, but against a player who has played many times in past speed chess championships, chess champions tour, etc. So it should be very exciting. But at any rate, I hope you guys enjoyed this really hype match between Magnus Carlsen, the former 5-time world champion, and of course Ian Nepomniachtchi, the twice runner-up for the world championship. So once again, make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I'll be back very soon with some more great YouTube only content. See you guys. Bye.